dealing with death in true lives.
There have been many attempts to describe what constitutes the Irish tradition, ranging all the way from, I suppose, a now redundant land of saints and scholars to the place of maximum conviviality in Europe, the land of the crack and good fellowship. But there's another Ireland, an Ireland much less advertised, as it were, which has to do with a long tradition of being haunted and being obsessed by death and dying. As Seamus Heaney once put it, a land coming to consciousness by leaping in graves. And this Ireland of the graves, this Ireland of the funerary tradition, is so pervasive and so deep-set that people hardly advert to it. But if you look around, you'll become very quickly aware of the obsessive hold that the dead have on the living in this country.
8 p.m. to the Church of the Assumption at Athenry. Mass tomorrow, Thursday at 12 noon.
Of Ballinrobe, County Mayo. Removal from St Joseph's Funeral Home, Glebe Street, Ballinrobe, this evening at 6:50 to St Mary's Church. That's at South.
They say in this town that if you're rubbed up against a boy at the mart, you have to go to his funeral, you know, and that's the way it works. Half the town appears at funerals. But people they would know awfully well, but they go and they shake hands and they know everybody and they make a point of saying to people, it's a community thing. You'll find in different parts of the country, wherever you go, things are different. People have different ways of doing things. It depends on basically the surrounding culture.
I guess I was early struck by the Irish self-consciousness about death with the famous toast, Boston Erin, to die in Ireland. It always, to me, made a funny contrast with a Jewish one I knew growing up in New York, which was next year in Jerusalem. Both of them are exile toasts, obviously. The Irish one, the wish to go back to Ireland, to die in Ireland. The Jewish one, picturing yourself in Jerusalem but alive.
There's a time for grieving, of course, but there's also a time for celebrating the life of the person, and that's what the partying is about. It often strikes me that it harps back to some degree to the old tradition of the wake, where in fact what you're doing is reasserting the power of life over death.
James Joyce once said that death was the highest form of life, the point towards which all living moved. And I think there's always been in Ireland a tremendous respect for the idea of death. I remember once being told an old woman in Connemara had said, there's something very respectable about a tidied corpse. And it was almost as if you got that feeling that the corpse achieved in death what might have been denied to it in life.
Michael has a clean burial in the far north, by the grace of the Almighty God. Artie will have a fine coffin out of the white boards and a deep grave, surely. What more can we want than that?
I don't think that the newfound affluence has made one whit of difference to cultural tradition about funerals or death. Funerals are still massive. The very fact that we have improved transport seems to mean that even more people will go to them. You'd get, for instance, teachers attending the funeral of a parent of one of their colleagues and travelling a couple of 100 miles to do that, and people being very moved by the effort they've made. So it seems to me in some ways funerals have kind of achieved an intensity that perhaps they hadn't had in the last 100 years, but had in the distant past.
Mobilisland rasende fartyg panna Basuachana te venakulio Vi fall synjenta I det tacht chan laidoch Sie de gori linjer chianti on vårt
It's been said about the Irish that we had the copyright on good grief, that what we did was that we took a scaffolding of ritual and we erected it around a family who had been battered, if you like, by the death that occurred. And what would happen is the local community would turn in their attention towards the bereaved family. Now, why would they do that? It was in their interests, because the health, the mental health of every community depended on the health of each individual cell or family within it. If they were farmers, so they let the hay lodge in the field. If they were fishermen, they'd beached the boats. And they took over the business of bereavement. I mean, they fed and watered everybody who came into the house. And the reason they did that was so the family wouldn't be distracted from the work of grieving by being busy, literally. Now, the family were in their own home. They kept the dead body in the house for a number of days to get used to that kind of reality. They shouldered him out themselves, they dug the grave themselves, they filled in the grave, they came back then, they had food and drink and talk and tears and laughter, whatever they wanted to be. In other words, they could be real. And see, that was the whole purpose of it, was to allow them to be real and face the reality, feel the pain, and gradually recommit themselves back into the life of the community.
Sonny and Lil were very happily married. Were very, very close. He used to go out every weekend and have their few little drinks. Might go out dancing on an odd weekend as well to try and bring back our memories as was in their single days. They were very, 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 very close. When poor Lil died, it went to his heart. He went downhill. He lost all willpower to live. The day that we got the letter to go up to the Beaumont, we were interviewed by a young doctor. First thing Sonny said to him, he says, "How long have I to go?" Anything from 3 months to 12 months. And he says, "I'll tell you one thing," Sonny said to him. "I'll neither give up my cigarettes, nor I won't give up my drink." And the doctor says to him, "Well, fair play to you."
In the old times, people used to go out and at the break of dawn if somebody died in the house at night, and they'd stand on a high part of the land near the house and give out a very high cry, so that all the neighbours would know that a person had died. That was known as the Sgradwania, the dawn cry. They used to wake the corpses for 3 days. The old understanding was that the spirit didn't leave, you know, for 3 days, and that it wasn't right to drive the spirit away all of a sudden. The important thing was to stay awake and keep an eye on the corpse.
Oh, come all you party panelites from Cork Street and the Coombe. If you'll pay attention for a while, I'll tell you very soon. I'd like to sing a comic song, and I'll make no mistake. It's not about the right man's ball, it's all about his wake.
Some party come along and wash the corpse, put a habit on it, maybe a man or a woman, and put it on the bed. And he had all coloured paper around the walls. And every murder had to be covered. Some of the women would come in and gaggled. And if it was a woman, they'd be kissing the cheek off her. You know, and he'd rub the old forehead and say, God be with you, Mary, whatever she was, you know. You won't be long and all this carry on. But they were all just drunk happening, you know.
There was no drink much involved, but the people, they'd cut up loads of pans, bread and jam, and there'd be loads of tea made.
The night time then, the people all went down to the pub and had a couple of gags. At the end of the night then, he came up to the house and he had more drink up there. But then during the night then, the games would all start. The big crack was great. They'd be rolling and shouting and singing.
They used to play spin the bottle. They used to play loads of games, you know, and they'd tell the worstest jokes you ever heard. Still, it should have been sorrow, but it used to be always fun.
By the postman. That was a new postman, Charlie come. And he come up, you see the Henry, and he says, it's an awful length of a lane, Henry, up to your house. And he says, it is, it's very long. But if it was any shorter, it wouldn't reach the house.
There's an extraordinary connection in the Irish funeral tradition between death, sex, and celebration. In fact, the Irish funeral tradition is a kind of local outpost of a great Europe-wide carnivalesque tradition, and also a temporary therapeutic rebellion against the authorities, particularly, I suppose, against the clerical authorities, because many of these wake celebrations were very profane and often very lewd parodies of Christian ceremonial, particularly marriage. It seems as if in our tradition a corpse licensed lewdness and erotic display, oddly enough.
There's a lot of material in the wakes which show that many of the practices are associated with very archaic traditions. At the wake, the person doesn't belong fully to this world, and he hasn't yet arrived, as it were, in the other world. He's in between. And you have a parallel with this at the sacred times of the year, like Samhain and Bealtaine, Halloween and May Day, the two great Celtic festivals. If you take the example of Samhain, it's neither the dark half of the year nor the bright half. It's in between. So all movement has stopped. When a death takes place, it's something like that. This is symbolized in certain ways. The clock is stopped. If a big clock on the wall, the hands going around, there's movement. Now, that's stopped. There's also a question of turning the mirror to the wall. And this probably refers more to the preservation of the living than to the dead. As a death, it's a very mysterious affair, and there may be spirits of all kinds surrounding the body. If there is a mirror on the wall and you look into it, according to ancient tradition, there's this feeling that your soul comes out of your body and it's there in the mirror. So you're left in a very vulnerable position, a very dangerous position in which demons or spirits could take your soul.
Time plays a huge part in it, and among travellers, time should never be our master. And travellers come from a nomadic background, and the whole movement is part of their culture. And I remember as a child being told hell is like a clock, that this keeps going tick-tock and never stops. And you were there in the one place, in the one spot, for eternity. When a lot of people hear about travellers and they burn maybe a caravan in not so distant past, they used to have these beautiful barrel-top wagons and they used to burn them. But I just think it's very hard for people to understand why. Like, you know, particularly if you have if in the middle of the winter and then suddenly you make yourself homeless by doing this. But it has an important aspect to travellers around how you allow people rest.
The majority of travellers are Catholic, and we have a strong belief in going to heaven or going to a better place. So by burning the belongings of that person, you're burning all the bad lucks and you're letting that person go to a better place.
Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us once again. That strange, eerie and somewhat frightening sound you've just been listening to is that of one of the country's last Mná Caointe, or keening women, recorded in...
Well, everybody that died was keened. It was, in fact, a sung lament. There were 3 steps to a round of keening. The first one could be either spoken or sung, which was, well, I like to call it the garim, or call, or salutation. She called the dead man as if he were alive, because the entire keen is addressed to the dead person as if he were alive. Just to illustrate it for you, I'll illustrate it from the beginning of the keen for RTE, who was shot in 1773. She would have started off by saying something like, and she could repeat it, Maghra go dainganta, Maghra go dainganta. Lada vaca hu I county on var going hug mahuila hug machritang of the daily summer lat of vadovalalat. And then she would start the gull, and the entire company would join her. Na-ha-ha, na-ha-ha-ha, na-ha-ha-ha, oh-ho-ho. A few years ago, I happened to give a lecture in Connemara on Irish music, and at the end of the lecture, an old man came up to me, positively shaking with emotion, and he took my hand in his 2 hands, and he said, "Oh," he said, "I didn't know you were going to keen." He says, "I was listening to my mother long ago as you were doing it. That's exactly how she did it." He said that his little brother of 3 years of age had died. and that the mother, for months afterwards, when a fit of sorrow would come on her, that she would take a garment, maybe a little ganzi belonging to the child, and hug it. And she was a beautiful singer, he said, the Hassas Schnechte Gestechtle, and she would keen him. She would sing a keen for him. And then she'd be all right, which was fascinating, because here was the release function of the keen.
The importance of burials and funerals in traditional Irish society comes across very, very strongly in the folklore and the popular memory of the famine. 100 years after the famine, in 1945, the Irish Folklore Commission undertook a survey looking for popular recollections of the famine throughout the country. And over again, these stories illustrate the obscenity of the famine by pointing to the fact that the ordinary funeral practices and the ordinary burial habits were abandoned. So people tell stories about bodies being buried without coffins, bodies being buried in coffins with a sliding door which would be taken away and the coffin would be reused again. People being buried outside consecrated ground, people were buried in shallow graves outside graveyards, and that their bodies would later be dug up by animals and eaten. Entire families would die, perhaps of the fever, and there would be literally nobody there to bury them, and they wouldn't leave the world in the proper way.
The vast majority of people in this part of Dublin would have come into Dublin during the famine. The unlucky ones who didn't make it to America and Australia and all the rest of it. And they brought all the rural traditions and all the rural superstitions with them. There was this tradition that the Banshee followed the old Irish families. I certainly remember hearing the Banshee myself. And my father was on night walk and myself and my mother heard it, and of course, I was quite young, but I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't normal.
There was those on Mercyford, Wales. Oh, it was dreadful. I never forget as long as I live. I never witnessed anything like it. But I was crying. And I said to my father, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "Look it's only the Banshee. She comes when there's somebody going to die."
The next day everybody was talking about it, and everybody was agreed it was a Banshee. Partly because nobody could identify exactly where the sound was coming from, and it appeared to be coming from different places to different people.
It's the counterpart of the human keening woman, like the Banshee sort of crying death into the community, the human keening woman crying death out of the community. What it means to people nowadays is that the journey is not made on your own, but actually that somebody has come for you and that you are being accompanied into the great unknown.
People had the instinct, or they could see what was going to happen when death was coming. Some people would get the sense of smell, they'd smell, as they would call balhanahuja, which would be the smell of the soil of the grave. And if they would get that smell, they would know that that person would die within a certain period. They would see a boat sailing over dry land, not on the sea at all or the water, but sailing over dry land. And the person with their head down would be the person that was going to die. And I had seen that once myself, but you don't see that with your corporal eyes. You see it with what we call the Sulín Dríochta, or the eye inside in your head, the magic eye.
There certainly is a tendency after the famine to have much more respectable and church-oriented funerals, much more so than before the famine, when there might be a wake in the house, and the clergy had been campaigning against that sort of burial for perhaps 100 years or more before the famine, without a great deal of success. But the famine seems to have torn Irish society apart so much that a lot of these old practices disappear.
I suppose there's always been a process of change, really, in relation to the way. One of the main reasons being that the church's requirement that the body be taken to the church on the second night, in other words, that it be waked there, and that, of course, did influence the decline of the wake games and the lamenting, because the context in which these were performed was over the corpse, in the presence of the corpse. It was being done for the corpse. It didn't really make sense once the body was no longer there.
The reason I'd get up at 4 o'clock would be that you'd have a lot of people during the day coming up and tormenting you and looking down on you. And I'm a very individualistic person. I love to do my own thing without any interference. Like, for instance, people saying, who's dead? I try to explain to them, would he be relation to so-and-so? So as a result of that, it would be just an impossibility to dig the graves. In this area here, we have the majority of the wealthiest people of this town are buried. And then there's, of course, there's a sectarian situation in it, like, you know. We have the Church of Ireland over here, and then right behind me we have a Presbyterian. This section up here was 10 shillings, and down there where the fairly poor people were buried, it was 5 pence, but I'm sure that these people are in heaven as them people, I presume, here are also. But as I said, death is a great leveller.
I think the cemetery plays a rather an ambiguous role, really, in death belief and in people's attitudes to the dead.
In the Mediterranean, particularly in Greece, is a very good example of this. You'll always see people in the cemetery, not just after a Mass on Sunday like here, but women in particular are always going every afternoon into cemeteries and graveyards. The cemetery is a very important scene of connection, of ongoing connection with the dead.
The cemetery was not a place that people went on a regular basis, and we have many legends and stories to tell us that. In fact, we have a lot of prayers which protect us when we're passing by the cemetery. We pray for the dead. but we sort of hope we'll get by all right. Many folk tales associated with it, and many jokes associated with it as well, and they all hang around the place, but it's not a place to be.
A graveside was always a terrifying place, but it was less terrifying if you believed there was something else to happen afterwards. If you stand on the edge of the grave, as Leopold Bloom does in Glasnevin in Joyce's Ulysses, and you don't believe in an afterlife, it's a very bleak moment. And I think that's one reason why you have this paradox that still large numbers of Irish people will attend funerals, but I suspect very few of those who do regularly visit cemeteries.
One of the things that's happened with, let's say, wakes is that they have, to a degree, lost their potency in the culture. They've been gentrified, as it were. They've moved into funerary parlours and so on. They haven't got the same energy or the same communal binding thing as they once had in certainly in 19th century Ireland and earlier. But in a curious way, the wake has migrated into the culture, and particularly into the theatre.
The story of the corpse that sits up and begins to speak is an old, hoary, melodramatic device that you get, for instance, in J.M. Singh's play The Shadow of the Glen, and it's very old in folklore itself, but it's a very good working metaphor of the Irish imagination, because I think Irish people don't believe ultimately in the finality of death at all. Beckett wrote that in Waiting for Godot, all the dead voices, they make a sound like leaves. To have lived is not enough for them, they have to talk about it. And that would be a link across to, say, an Irish language contemporary of Beckett, Martin O'Kine, who set his greatest work, Cranachilla, in a graveyard in Connemara. And in each chapter, a new person from the village above is buried, and all the corpses have a rattling good conversation about the latest news. So it's almost as if Irish people believe that the challenge presented by death is just the ultimate test of your power to articulate, and that it really does go on the other side of the grave.
I couldn't bear to think of anyone running off with my bones when I'm dead.
No one will run off at your bones, Mary Johnny. Sure, it's a small truck that needs to start off.
The Irish funerary tradition hasn't ended with Synge or Beckett or Joyce. In the new wave of Irish dramatists, people like Marina Carr or Martin McDonagh, Macpherson, you've got again the old revenants, the corpses, the ghosts, the funeral. It shows how very difficult, despite a kind of superficial modernity, it's been to get rid of all these old preoccupations.
I shouldered a kind of manhood, stepping in to lift the coffins of dead relations. They had been laid out in tainted rooms, their eyelids glistening, their dough-white hands shackled in rosary beads. Their puffed knuckles had unwrinkled, the nails were darkened, the wrists obediently sloped. The dulse brown shroud, the quilted satin cribs. I knelt courteously, admiring it all. As wax melted down and vaned the candles, the flames hovering to the women hovering behind me. And always, in a corner, the coffin lid, its nail heads dressed with little gleaming crosses. Dear soapstone masks. Kissing their igloo brows had to suffice before the nails were sunk and the black glacier of each funeral pushed away.
A lot of the things you see that people go through during the death don't seem to make a whole lot of sense until you're going through it yourself. Like situations where everybody queues up in the church and goes up to pay their condolences to the family. That always struck me as rather strange and weird, and I felt very uncomfortable with it, you know. When my own father died, it was only then I realised how much solace the family get from this huge big line of people parading by, whether you know them or not, and saying, "I'm sorry for your trouble."
It's Anna Coon, and it was written to commemorate a drowning tragedy on the Corrib in the 1800s. And the first time I played it at a funeral was when my uncle Paddy died. He was a musician. I played it at his funeral because I felt that it was some way of acknowledging his music. About a week later, a neighbouring woman came up to me and asked me would I play Anna Coon at her funeral, and I was quite shocked, you know, and my brother was with me, and I said, "What do you say, you know?" And he said, "Tell her you will, you know." She died about 8 years later. It was a very strange feeling, but again, like that, you do something when you can, and obviously the music touched her, the emotion. Since then, somebody else has asked me, you know, an old friend. It's something I haven't told anybody who it is, but it's between me and them, you know.
It's an important part of your life. It could be an act of your life, how you would like to see it out at the end. And of course, in the Middle Ages, it was a very normal thing to do for people to plan their own funerals and to give instructions before they died on what was to be done. I know my father gave instructions before he died just 10 years ago. I mean, one of the things he had was, he said, "Make sure my pants is on in the coffin." And I said, "Why? Some of these undertakers don't bother," he said, you know. And we could laugh about that. And at the same time, he was just, I suppose, saying, "Make sure I'm okay."
He wanted a band, he wanted to have a dance as well. But we thought that we might be going a bit too far with that, you know what I mean? Although we were trying it, and we came to the conclusion that it wouldn't look right. You know what I mean? We often heard telling McNamara's band we played wakes and weddings and at every county board. It mightn't have, but we decided that we wouldn't do it, and I think it went off beautifully. Well, I'd say if he could get rid of the box open and seen that funeral, I'd say he'd let two or three great cheers. He'd have been very proud of it, because he didn't even expect a big funeral himself, because he wasn't so long in the vicinity of Clondra. But the people of Clondra were great to him.
As a family gathered together today, we pray to the Father as Jesus himself taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
I think that the Irish funerary tradition, and in fact everything encompassed in that, and the attitudes and talk about death, the ritualization of death, the memory of the dead, is still a central feature of Irish life. Certainly in local worlds, it's an opportunity to define community, define family, define the meaning of local worlds. And on the national scene, of course, there's a very central role that death has always played, in the memory of the dead, in Ireland's definition of itself as a nation.
Funerals are turned now into symbolic demonstrations of the state the culture is now at. If you think of the funeral of Jack Lynch, for instance, it was in some ways an interesting analogy, would say, that of O'Donovan Rossa at the beginning of the century, because both of them became, if you like, vehicles for a political statement. Pearse used O'Donovan Ross's to make his claim about the vibrancy of the Fenian tradition, that even the dead Fenians could speak. But equally, Desmond O'Malley and, if you like, the PD wing of Fianna Fáil was able to assert the values that they identified with Jack Lynch at the moment of his death, and to do so in the contemporary context, which gave that even more spin, if you like.
After him came a deluge of volatility, among other things. But it was in Northern Ireland and from Northern Ireland that his greatest challenges came.
There was a Phalange general in the Spanish Civil War. His men used to march under the slogan, Viva la Muerte, long live death, and that's basically a deep Republican slogan. Arbor Hill here is really the kind of crucible of the political funeral. The political Republican funeral is a compound of usually a hunger strike followed by a funeral whose intellectual sort of substructure really comes out of Hamlet. The ghost stops Hamlet and says, "Revenge me. If our deed isn't sufficient to do it, let another generation do it." You know, the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us, our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. Literally, the graves are going to be the source of endless violence if we don't get what we want.
Republican funerals have always drawn a crowd here in West Belfast, but never a crowd quite like this. Quite simply, this is one of the biggest political funerals in the history of Ireland. And here today, a whole community, it seems, has turned out in an obvious, overwhelming show of solidarity for the hunger strikers and the late Bobby Sands.
Those funerals had a big, big impact worldwide. For the first time, people began to ask the question, well, what is it they're dying for if they're prepared to give their own lives? Up till then, I think that they had been presented very successfully, really, in the world's media by the British government as mindless thugs and hooligans and psychopaths for the most part, but evil men. And the fact that they were prepared to die themselves in such a painful way, I think had a very big impact. And the funerals were the conclusion of that, but it was actually the deaths that had the impact, I think.
The scene of death is a scene of contest for control and definition of death and the dead. So that in the scene of the funeral, you have the family, you have the IRA, you have the British Army, and you have the Catholic Church, all represented, and sometimes almost fighting for control of the body.
There were scuffles with the police as the body of 19-year-old William Fleming was taken from his home. The RUC wanted to ensure that the coffin wasn't covered by the Irish tricolour, which is illegal in Northern Ireland.
Certainly fighting for control, the definition of the death. Is this the death primarily of a member of a family, and you have a tearful mother and father? Is it the death of a Catholic, or has he been excommunicated by virtue of being a paramilitary? Is it the death of a hero, a nationalist hero, or is it the death of a criminal terrorist? Each group there is seeking by their presence to define the death as one thing or another.
I think that there has been in Northern Ireland traditionally, and particularly over the past 30 years, a very difficult relationship between the church and paramilitary organisations, because on the one hand, the man or woman who has died is a member of the community, and the church wants to give them the benefit of the funeral rites, but on the other hand, they don't want to endorse the aims of the paramilitary organisations. It was Bishop Edward Daly who took the first stance against it and said that they couldn't have paramilitary symbolism while it was in the church. I think that what they did after they left the grounds of the church was then their own business. But it was quite a tricky one for the church because, of course, politically also, the church didn't want to incur the disapproval of the community, and the community would have been extremely upset if people had been in any way denied what they saw as the full ceremony of a funeral.
It's the big unsolved mystery of the Troubles. What happened to the disappeared? Up to 20 people who went missing during the 1970s, believed to have been murdered by the IRA and buried in unmarked graves.
I used to walk around the streets and look up in houses and wonder would he be in that house, would they have him tied up in there? And my son used to go up the Glen Road in the mornings and look for his body, round the bushes and in the fields, and I used to get into his wee bed and see if I could dream where he was. I mean, for all them years, 21 years, you just were always wondering. That was your first thought in the morning, your last at night, wondering where he's buried. I started digging for the bodies, and then it was on the 29th of June. We were being told that all the digs was being stopped. And then, within about half an hour, the Garda went to the spot, found brand new shoes, and then they found the human remains. I had him in the house here for 3 nights, and which was nice, you know, and the place was packed every day, every night. You know, it just never ceased. The funeral was really, it was something special for me. I was so proud, really felt very proud, you know. He was so much loved, and all his friends that I hadn't seen in years. And now we're able to go to his grave every day. You know, it's lovely to be able to do that.
In many ways, funerals have been repossessed by the ordinary community. One of the most notable features I've seen at funerals here in Dublin in the last 15 years is that almost inevitably now a member of the dead person's family gets up and speaks and actually narrates the life of the person who has died and puts, you know, a shape, a final closure on things. The fact that lay people are standing on altars and doing that is a huge change from the days when you might have had a well-intentioned priest saying a mass for someone he didn't know all that well, and there was a tremendous impersonality about the experience. And there is a sense in which the funeral has been democratized, that the old promise of Vatican II in the 1960s, the priesthood of the laity, has finally been implemented in, of all places, at Irish funerals.
The curious thing is that funerals are still the point of maximal social engagement in the country. More than a wedding, more than a birth, it's still the funeral that draws people together. There was a very fertile aspect to our relationship to the dead and to the whole funerary tradition, because it constitutes the darkness out of which so much Irish creativity has grown, has arisen. And there is a danger that if we lose that central core of our identity, which I think is the grave and our responses to the grave and that kind of darkness, it may well be that we lose large dimensions of our creativity as well.
Sometimes people say that the older system was best and we should go back to the older system. I think there's two things you have to understand about any tradition. One is that there's a value at the heart of it. And the value at the heart of the bereavement tradition was that you assisted people to grieve well, so that they could be real people. Then the second element was the format, or the way it was done. And of course, what was appropriate 100 years ago isn't necessarily appropriate now. It could be anachronistic now. So I'd be much more intent on saying, let's make sure that the value is there, and then let's try and find new ways to parse our grief.
I'll walk beside you through the passing years, through days of clouds and sunshine, joy and tears.
And True Lives returns in 2 weeks' time with Ahakishta, the small town in the southwest of Ireland off which Air India Flight 182 crashed in 1985. The story of the aftermath can be seen on the 14th of November at the usual time of 10 p.m. Next Tuesday at 10, you can see Crime Line.
I'll walk beside you to the land of dreams.